powers that have been unleashed across the world, especially across the Western world, and on campuses and in universities and in elite institutions against the Jews, that didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, in fact, it is the result of decades of investment at the level of ideas.
Hi, and welcome to the Z3 podcast. I am Amitai Fraiman. I'm the director of the Z3 project. In today's episode, I sit in conversation with David Hazony. He is the editor of Jewish Priorities, 65 Proposals for the Future of Our People. And he is the incoming director of the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities and the Senior Steindart Fellow. And in this conversation, we hear about David's background. We talk about the book. We talk about this moment we are in. And we end by covering a little bit about what the Institute will do, its goals, and how we plan to achieve them. So we hope you enjoyed the episode. Follow us on our various platforms on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, Instagram, and TikTok. Subscribe to our email list, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Have a great one. David Hazony, welcome to the Z3 podcast. It's great to have you here in person in Palo Alto. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amitai, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the point of this podcast, it's part of the Z3 project, and the idea is to try and extend some of the conversations that we have year-round at our conference, but also to other platforms, other mediums. And this is an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper with some leading thinkers and activists in the field in the Jewish world and beyond. And it's just great to have you here today.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So I think, what we typically do is I'd like to give us a little bit of a background, or our listeners a background of who's with us today. I mean, you and I know each other for a little while now, but I'm not sure how many of our listeners know. And I would like to just contextualize, tell them a little bit about your professional background and what are you up to these days, and kind of situate the conversation within that context.
Okay, well, I grew up in New Jersey to Israeli parents, moved to Boston for high school, made Aliyah at the age of 24, became very religious, went to Yeshiva University, moved to Israel, started a family, continued my very deep kind of exploration of classic texts, whether it's the Bible or the Talmud or the commentaries and so forth. In parallel, I also did a PhD at Hebrew University in Jewish philosophy, and was very much involved in starting the think tank in Jerusalem, known then as the Shalem Center. Today it's Shalem College. Excuse me. And so over the years, I developed both a deep understanding of our traditions, and both from an academic and a sort of yeshiva perspective. I also experienced many different aspects of Jewish life, both in America and in Israel. I was the editor of a long-form journal called Azure, or Tchelet, which came out both in English and Hebrew, and was, at the time, the leading journal of public affairs in Israel. With time, I left that position, and I got more involved in books. I came to Washington for 4 years, where I worked at the Israel Project, launched something called The Tower, which was also a long-form publication. I built a very broad network of friends who are also writers and scholars in many different areas. And it was in 2019 that I connected with Adam Bellow, who is the son of Saul Bellow and a lifelong publisher, an editor, really legendary in the field of commercial book publishing. One of the things that I noticed when I was in Washington was that I had spent a lot of my career in the nonprofit world working on books and texts that I thought were important and powerful and really moved the needle. But while I was there, the TV show Fauda came out, and it kind of set me, I was taken aback by it. It was a great show, but I felt like all of this work that, the pro-Israel community, advocacy, hasbara, however you want to name it, was, within the nonprofit context, was suddenly kind of overshadowed by a single popular TV show. And it troubled me deeply, because it said to me, maybe there's something we in the nonprofit world have to learn from the commercial world and from what works, not just what, we always in the nonprofit world talk about metrics of impact. And how do you know that you're making any impact? Well, you measure how many hits you get, how many clicks you get, how many, But the truth is that there are very few measures of impact, metrics of impact, quite as powerful as sales. All right, when you have an important book, a message you want to deliver. If people are willing to actually take out their credit cards and buy something, that says something about impact that isn't said by simply, people who watch your YouTube video. So I kind of sought out Adam, and he turns out also sought me out. He was in the middle of launching a new publishing house called Wicked Sun Books, and he asked me to help him recruit authors, recruit books, and I said, okay, I'll do that, but I want to take you on as a mentor. I need your commercial wisdom, because he knew how to make books sell. He had dozens of best-selling books under his belt, and absolutely lovely man to work with. And it was in that context that he approached me about doing an anthology. And he said, did you know that anthologies can actually have a very big impact on the discourse? And I said, I had no idea, because I've never walked into a bookstore and said, hey, show me your anthologies, right? He said, no, listen. If you pick the right niche, and you can really create kind of a snapshot of a generation, or even the core of a movement, and it becomes something everybody has to have on their bookshelves. And it depends what your niche is. And I said, well, I've been Orthodox and I've been secular. I've been Israeli and I've been American. And how about my niche is the whole Jewish people? And he laughed and I laughed, and we both thought it was really funny. And then it started eating away at us. Like, maybe this is something that can actually work. Nothing like it has been done since, the Talmud, where you have a single anthology that captures the entirety of the Jewish people from left to right, politically, from all denominations plus unaffiliated, or secular, however you want to call it, from younger influencers to veteran writers, and both religious and lay leaders, all in one single anthology. And we started working on it. We came up with a formula where we would tell each writer to imagine you're giving a TED Talk to the whole Jewish people, and you can only talk about one core priority for a collective future as a people. And part of my job was to make sure the writing was a certain level, and part of my job was to make sure we didn't have 6 essays on why everybody should learn Hebrew. And but mainly I wanted to create a kind of like a Thanksgiving dinner for the whole family, where everybody's there, including that cousin that you can't stand, but he has to be there and you have to be there because you're one family, and that's just it. And we started with a core group of writers who were fairly well known, that became sort of the selling point to other writers, including a lot that I didn't know personally, as well as quite a few that I had actually never heard of. But I did my homework, and we ended up with just something. We thought we were going to do 30, and then it just kept expanding and expanding. We said, okay, well, we have a fashion blogger, we have a stand-up comic, we have Omri Caspi, an NBA star, but we also have Ruth Weiss and Shaul Magid, and so Brett Stevens, Dara Horn, Natan Sharansky, just a whole lot of really, really interesting people. Einat Wilf, Isabel Tabarovsky, sort of from many different areas. Hillel Neuer, the head of UN Watch, is there, and William Daroff, the head of the Conference of Presidents, sort of representing the sort of institutional establishment. We have some philanthropists and philanthropic experts who are writing in there, and just it's all over the place, and it's a lot of fun. And the publication date was set for October 24th, 2023. We had garnered a lot of interest from both institutions and sort of event venues, and we said, let's take this. Before the war came, we had this whole plan where we'd take this show on the road and sort of put our Jewish peoplehood on display, not coming together over the things we agree on, but coming together over the things we disagree on. disagreeing together. And it was, we had a full day festival, what we saw as a festival lined up with 30 speakers at the Weizmann Museum in Philadelphia. Um, we had something at the Stryker Center in New York with a panel of 9 speakers, emceed by Leah Leibovitz and Stephanie Butnick of the Unorthodox podcast. And we had a panel set up at the Z3 conference, which I was very excited for. And then October 7th came. And it was, as an Israeli, I live in Jerusalem. As an Israeli, it was, a horror and a shock. And like every Israeli, it wasn't, 1 or 2 people that I knew indirectly who had been affected. It was 4, 5, 6 different, lines of connection to the actual victims, including somebody I know personally who is still captive, still hostage, including people who my son's best friend was killed, and the list goes on, and I'm sure anyone who's spoken to Israelis has heard a similar list. And in moments of shock and horror and trauma, one of the things you do is just to deal with it is to sort of put one foot in front of the other. You still have to get to figure out how you're going to work and how you're going to have your kids taken care of. I live in Jerusalem, so it wasn't, once the first 3 days were over and the terrorists were definitively out of our country, it was it was more just about the mental state that you're in. And one of the things being practical meant for me was to focus on the question of what was going to happen to my book launch. It's sort of the nightmare of every author that you, just before, you spend 1 or 2 or 10 years on a book, and then, the world blows up just as you're about to launch it. So my initial expectation was that the whole thing was going to be canceled or pushed off, the whole, and then one by one, the hosts of all of these events, we're talking about 10 different events, some smaller, some larger, that were lined up, reached out to me and said, we need this right now. We need this event to happen. We need to come together. You don't understand how the Jews of America are feeling right now, which is true. I had no clue because I was being a Jew of Israel in my own trauma. And so I got on a plane, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, 2 weeks into this war, to leave my family behind and come to the U.S. And I found an American Jewish community that was simultaneously in shock and trauma, but also feeling very lonely and afraid, which was a little different from what we had been feeling in Israel, and also mobilizing for Israel. A lot of stuff got off the ground super quickly, raising a huge amount of money to help the soldiers, to help the reservists get gear, to help to talk about rebuilding the communities and so on, and helping the refugees, the Israeli refugees. And so I spent 3 weeks here, and I felt like I had a lot to say. Really did. I felt like the Israeli response was so very different from the American Jewish response, partly because of the different realities we were in. Israel has an army. Israel has a country. It has an obligation to respond decisively, but partly also because of the cultural difference between American and Israeli Jewry. So one of the things that struck me was, we had our first 3 days of horror. And at the end of those 3 days, we Israelis switched from, shock and what the hell is going on mode. We are being invaded, which is something no Israeli recalls under a certain age, unless you remember the Yom Kippur War, which I don't. We switched from that to war, to a war footing, to a war mentality, which is something we know how to do. But it was an all-out war mentality, which meant what? It meant, first of all, a huge number of reservists were called up, 300,000 reservists. My I had 2 kids already in the Army, but by the end of the second day, I had 5 in the Army in uniform. And I still have a couple who are in combat right now. But also on the civil society level, Israelis simply mobilized immediately, universally. All the politics dropped, right? A unity government or some form of a unity government was created. And the whole country mobilized to help on the civilian side, to help on the military side. And it was breathtaking. And it was something that most people were very surprised by. I was not quite so surprised by it for the simple reason that I had been watching the protest movement, the judicial reform. Remember that? The judicial reform protest movement. And I had actually written about this. I noticed that there's something really different about it in that it's the only protest movement in the democratic world that I can recall where both sides waved the same national flag. So I knew that deep down inside, this was a country that was very proudly Israeli. They had different conceptions of what being Israeli meant and what the country should be, and felt that it was being threatened, and that's why there was the conflict. But deep down inside, there was a very, very powerful unifying force, and so it didn't surprise me that much that Israelis came together the way they did. But I asked myself, what would it be like if the diaspora were to come together with that kind of energy, with that kind of unbelievable power and sort of spiritual energies to mobilize in that way? And I started writing. I published, I think, 5 pieces in the first month. I even published a piece on October 8th that I do not recall writing. But it was in the New York Post. It was just about how we're going to pull together, we're going to defeat this enemy. But one of the pieces I wrote that I think was very, it really resonated with a surprising number of American Jews, was in Sapir, the Sapir Journal. It was called "The War Against the Jews," where my core thesis was, hey, diaspora Jews, I know you're scared and you're feeling lonely and you're mobilizing for Israel, but what's really happening is a global war against the Jewish people. That all those demonstrations that are spontaneously, have arisen, that's not triggered by or a response to Israel's reaction. This is not a protest against Israel's retaliation. This is something that spontaneously erupted in sympathy with, in cause with, Hamas's attack itself. And this is an attack on global Jewry. It's anti-Semitism. It's not just protesting Israel. And the proper response to this is, the natural Jewish diaspora response to it is, it's a pogrom. It's one of fear. But my argument was, and I still maintain this, that's the incorrect response, because pogrom assumes that we in exile have no power, and we don't have the ability to fight back against a war against the Jews. But the truth is that the Jewish people are much, much more powerful worldwide than we have been before. If we pull together, if we focus our energies the way Israelis did, you can, and if we make a mental switch that says, let's not look at this as paralyzing fear, and let's not respond through rage. Let's mobilize our minds and our resources to fighting this war. Let's think like generals and strategists and tacticians. Let's collect, let's start talking about intelligence gathering. Let's talk about protecting Jewish communities. Let's talk about knowing who our allies actually are. Because guess what? It's not the whole world against us. It's actually a relatively small portion of the world, and not particularly powerful one. And the moment you take that step back and you make that switch, you can sort of break down the problem into a set of operational challenges. And the most important thing, I think, is you also need to identify your enemies, call them enemies. Don't be afraid of that word. And so I laid out kind of an 8-point plan, or 8 principles about what it would mean for the diaspora to fight this war, because war has been declared against the Jews. And the only question is, are we going to fight back, or are we going to, focus our philanthropic energies on helping Israel and our psychological energies on being scared and lonely? So it was in all of this context that, well, we can talk about it. But that's kind of what's happened is that this whole Jewish Priorities project shifted in its meaning very powerfully. It became a focus of Jewish togetherness and of Jewish unity that was very surprising. That all of a sudden, and every single event happened, but it was completely reframed. And every panel discussion was obviously had October 7th very heavily in our minds, but to have Brett Stevens and Jody Rudorin sitting together with Ishai Fleischer, and a panel with Shlomo Elkan, Rabbi Shlomo Elkan, the Chabad Shaliach at Oberlin College, and just all of these different people coming together in these panels, all of us thrown into this post-October 7th moment and seeing visually our people come together, both Israelis and American Jews, both secular and Orthodox, and it was just very, very powerful and moving. We gain energy from seeing things with our eyes. Just like, how do people ask me, sorry about that. We can edit that muffle. People ask me, where do you get energy from? And I know that I get my strength and my energy post October 7th. I got it from my kids, right? I got it from talking to the young people who were being drafted or called up to fight an actual war, and I saw their energy and their real, how would you say, mura'alim, the real, fighting power,
fighting spirit,
and I think that we can all gain from that, because there are times when you have to, switch from being Athens to being Sparta to some degree.
So when you covered a lot.
Yeah.
So I have some questions to certain elements, and I want to tease out some themes that I'm hearing and some components of the work and what you're talking about. So I think I want to start first. Actually, let's take us back to the beginning of it a little bit. But you said that you grew up in New Jersey as an Israeli.
Yeah.
And now you live back you're in Israel again, but I'm curious to hear about how kind of that mixture of Israeliness and Americanness kind of informs some of the work. And I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I want to ground it in that, because I think that there is something there, and the way that you're describing the way you see the world through an Israeli lens, but then coming here and understanding the American lens. I think that's helpful for some of our audiences who do span both of those, to kind of give that a name, right, and kind of put it in a frame for them to maybe identify within themselves as well.
So I grew up in an Israeli home as a child of Israelis in Princeton, New Jersey, a college town. At a time, and we're talking about the 1970s, this is before there were a lot of Israelis in America. It was very unusual to be Israeli. It was a time when if you heard Hebrew anywhere in America, and you know Hebrew, so you would run over to them and say, "What are you doing here?" It was that's how rare it was. And I grew up feeling like I was part of the Jewish community, but fundamentally different. The core cultural difference between Israeliness, especially, my parents moved here in 1965, so it's sort of an older Israeliness, and American Jewish culture, there's a very big gap. And part of, I guess, my quest over the years was to try to understand that gap. When I came back in the mid-20-teens to go to Washington, I actually wrote an essay called, I think it was called Israeli Culture and the Future of American Jewish Identity, where I noticed how the support for Israel in so many cases, the huge support for Israel that American Jewry displayed through AIPAC, but also through many, Israeli flags in all the synagogues and so forth, didn't come with a real deep understanding of what it meant to be Israeli. And so you would have these sort of crazy statements. Like, I was at a gala in Beverly Hills once raising money for Israel, where like this this woman at the head of the table I was sitting at yells out, "I love Israel, but I hate Israelis." And everybody laughed. And I thought to myself, it's a little weird. Like, what is Israel without Israelis? And fine, so we're rough around the edges. We're really, so much of what Americans may find uncomfortable about Israelis or dislike about Israelis comes down to cultural differences, right? I mean, if you move to France, you're going to, discover things you hate about the French and they have things they will despise about you Americans too. That's normal cultural difference. What was strange for me was how that cultural disengagement connected with an overwhelming support for the country I lived in. And I wrote about this at length because I thought that the key to the future of American Jewish identity was to start to tap into Israeli culture and Israeliness. And I saw Israel as the musical culture, the film culture, the tremendous creativity. And I know that we've talked a lot about Startup Nation, which is really kind of a high-tech corporate side of it. But there hasn't been a real discussion of the incredible creativity on the cultural side, whether it's literary or musical or film and so on and so forth. And that requires a lot of Hebrew. So ended up being kind of a call for people to learn Hebrew en masse. But I think that's changed since then. I wrote that probably in 2014, 2015. I think that today American Jews have a much greater awareness of Israel's cultural creativity and what it has to offer. I think that a lot more musicians and Fauda and other TV shows, a whole series of TV shows that either originate in Israel or simply are in Hebrew with subtitles, American Jews have been exposed to. I think that there really has been a lot of progress on that, but the key thing is to realize that this is not. When I was in Washington, we did a lot of polling. The Israel Project was known for its polling, and they sort of related to to the advocacy as kind of a political campaign. That was the value added of this organization. It was wonderful, and they kept saying that should we make arguments about why Israel is right, or should we talk about shared values, why Israel is like America? And I kept feeling like neither. The biggest reason to be interested in Israel is that it's interesting, is it's different, is that it offers something that American Jewish life might not necessarily have direct access to or come easily for it. And I think that actually, again, I think people have started to see Israel as kind of cool, interesting, different, attractive in a way that, and when I say people, I don't just mean Jews. I mean, inside of American culture more broadly, I think that Israel has become something really interesting. Again, that everything gets shaken up by October 7th and so forth, but still.
So you're talking about this, like there's a different brand maybe, or I don't know if brand is the right term, but a different line maybe of Judaism and Jewish culture that's developing in Israel. And I mean, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I do think there's an argument to be made for the two-sidedness of that relationship. I think that what we talk about a lot in Z3 has to do around how both can be richer and a more rounded Jewish identity by interacting. And I think that's an important piece to have a talk. But I do want to get back to the book in that sense, because I think some of that's what comes up in the book, right? In terms of there's 65 authors here, right? And they're from every walk of Jewish life and geography, basically. And I think, maybe it sounded like it was intentional, but I wonder if, like, if there's a way for a reader to think about this book as a guide to getting that multiple, that angle, that entry point, or that multiple entry points to Jewish identity, not just of like, different types of arguments, but also just like experiences, and how does that kind of translate into one's own life?
Well, yes, but I would put an asterisk on it, which is that, ironically, almost paradoxically, if American Jewry and American Jewish culture is to penetrate inside Israeli culture, it actually needs to kind of be a lot more independent of Israel. And this is something that the diasporists have right, okay? And it's something that actually, I wrote about this a long time ago. Gal Beckerman, who's the wonderful, wonderful author of books, and he has a new book out now called, I think it's called The Quiet Before, but he wrote this magisterial book on the Soviet Jewry movement. He was my editor at the Forward when I was writing op-eds many years ago, and he said, okay, look, I know your Israel-centric view of, I get it, but imagine you weren't. Imagine you were a diaspora Jew who believed in the diaspora. What advice would you give? And so I wrote a column about that called Own It Judaism, where I think that if Jews want to develop an alternative, if diaspora Jews want to develop an alternative, independent, thriving, powerful Jewish culture, they have to be a lot more really stand up and own their achievements and their successes to a much greater degree than they have. I quoted a speech given by Vice President at the time, Joe Biden, during Jewish American Heritage Month, and he talks about the incredible contributions of the Jews to American culture, from film and this and that. He goes through this whole list, and what I wrote at the time, what I thought was, that's exactly how Jews used to talk, but only privately, only in their homes and in shul, never in public. And I think that American Jewry, to the extent that the diaspora wants to and should and can, and really I'm in favor of it, build a thriving, powerful, independent Jewish culture, they have to do it in a way that distinguishes themselves from Israeli Jewishness. So in this sense, for example, someone like Shol Magid, and I get, for people for whom the only question is Zionism and anti-Zionism, might be very troubled that I included, people who are seen as anti-Zionists, and I don't love that description, because when
I don't think he doesn't identify as
I don't think he does, and but he is a diasporist.
Yes.
And I thought it was just wonderful, because I want that voice. I think we need that voice. We need diaspora Jews to be proud of who they are, and to create I think a very fruitful, very creative competition or competitive attitude between Israeli and diaspora culture. I don't think there's anything better than that. Yeah. Like that's what a thriving Jewish world looks like. Yeah. Is you have we're the best Jews because we got this and that.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with the essence of it. I don't know if I'd like I understand the value of the competitive nature of it. I think that for me, it's the language I like to use is the mutual dependency, not in terms of just survival, but even cultural enrichment, like a chavruta basically, right? What can we learn from each other?
Exactly,
right?
It's exactly chavruta.
And okay. I think that that's for me the imagery people talk about are we brothers and sisters? Are we a married couple? I'm like, no, we're a chavruta, and I think that's and sometimes it becomes it's an overused kind of imagery in our, but it's a powerful one. It is a powerful one. I think that people wonder the depth of the relationship of chavruta, when you have gone through that, and also when you see the text about it, you understand there's so much more there than I think meets the eye in terms of the nature of the relationship.
And one of the essays by William Kohlbrenner really talks about this. Yeah. It's called "Argue Like a Jew," and his claim is that Jews have a very long tradition of argumentation, where the purpose of argument isn't to kill each other, or isn't even to win. The purpose of argument is to learn. And he is very concerned that too many Jews have forgotten that and have instead adopted a kind of winner-take-all approach to argumentation.
Zero-sum kind of,
Right. And by the way, also Rabbi David Wolpe, writes about in similar terms in the book as well. I think that Chavruta is a wonderful, perfect analogy to what the relationship between sort of Israeli culture and diaspora culture should be. But for that to happen, it really needs to be on equal terms.
Yes.
And for that to happen, each side needs to see itself as in no way inferior and
Yes.
as being on equal
Well,
terms.
that's a long, there's a long-standing argument, like which, both sides has in my estimation, both Israelis and Americans have both a superiority complex and an inferiority complex at the same time.
But they
towards
always
the
go
other.
together.
Always do. They go together. This is
Right.
true. I know we're sitting on couches. I don't want to go into that realm too much. But I think that from the book's perspective, I think that's an interesting thing to take into account when one reads it. I am curious. You mentioned a lot about the pre and post October 7th. The war is still going on. It's taking devastating prices every day. And there's a couple questions related to that. One is, how would the book look different if it was written post, or is there a value in asking the authors to revisit their essays in a post October 7th lens, as a companion reader? Or a second edition, I don't know, something, just planting a seed. I know you have a lot of work anyway, but that's one. We can start there. But the second is related to something you said earlier about your time when you came to Washington and other moments where you, like the separation between Israelis and Israel, and how that plays into, on the pro side and also on the critical side of Israel, right? Where I find it's very easy to say the Israeli government, and for Israelis, I'm going to go a little longer here, but for Israelis, I'm like, or the military, I'm like, don't you? That's like we're all this there is no difference. There is no real separate. I mean, there is, but not fundamentally, right? It's not so distant as it might be in much larger countries, right? So I'm curious about the book, about how to look different, and then we can move into maybe if it's natural to kind of how that separation kind of influences the discourse.
Right. So the thing about books, both the advantage and the disadvantage, is that they take time to put together.
Yeah.
I'll let you in on a little secret. This book the manuscript was finished in December of 22, before the real eruption of the judicial reform controversy.
Yeah.
And we spent most of 2023 worried that the book was going to feel out of date because nothing in it addressed judicial reform. And then October 7th came along, wiped judicial reform off the table, and suddenly we didn't have that worry anymore. And we went back and we looked at the essays, and maybe there were one or two that felt out of date, but all of them, except with a few exceptions, either felt kind of timeless and evergreen, or more urgent than ever.
Interesting.
Isabella Tabarovsky's piece on the origins of Western anti-Semitism, David L. Bernstein's piece on it's called "Who Are the New Cossacks?" or confronting the new Cossacks, saying that we have a tradition as Western liberal Jews of looking to the right as the Cossacks of our time, but maybe it's actually on the left. Talk about oppression to peace. A whole series of essays that are no lesser. Hill Neuer's piece on how the international human rights movement was kind of hijacked by anti-Israel forces and how we can get it back. I mean, really, really amazingly prescient pieces. So I don't think it's really lost its urgency, and I think that the problem with doing a new version of it is that by the time it comes out,
who knows?
So something else will happen. Maybe peace will break out. So I think that it actually does withstand very powerfully, more than withstand. I think that that many of its essays are really augmented by the current crisis that we live in. Some were even proven right in very unfortunate ways. Other question? What was
The second piece about how you mentioned before the separation between Israel and Israelis, or even Israeliness, and I think that I've seen that also on the side that criticizes Israel a lot. There's a separation between the two, which is something that's, as an Israeli as well, it's something that's for me very difficult to kind of sit with, because these state functions, and it goes both ways, right? Like, I remember I was in APAC one year and somebody was like, Israel has to go in and to Lebanon, and I'm like, excuse me, am I going to go in, or is it going to be you?
Yeah.
Like this kind of like this. It's a fantasy version, right, or an imagined kind of. Well, there's an imagined identity, that's a separate piece. But I'm saying, like, how does that separation play both sides, and how do we, as a Jewish community, counter it, I guess?
I think that it gets down to the core of Jewish identity in the diaspora and how it's evolved over the past century, especially the last half century. We are Jews. Our core identity, I believe, is in a 3,000-year history, which is backed up by texts and backed up by rituals and backed up by a swarming, incredible journey of the imagination and of the intellect from generation to generation. A huge number of common experiences that are hours and hours alone. Traditions about morality and about how to live. Just this incredibly rich, powerful wisdom that we've carried over millennia. And unfortunately, in my view, most of American Jewish identity has been shifted towards focusing on two things. One is the Holocaust, and the other is being pro-Israel. And it's almost as though that our entire identity has come down to either we're slaughtered or we build something wonderful and defeat our enemies. But what happened to everything else? So I think that step number one is to kind of reopen the question as to what should be the core of Jewish identity, period. Once you do that, then you realize that there is no Israel without Israelis. There is no, much more important than being pro-Israel is knowing Israel, is coming to visit, is learning Hebrew, is connecting, not just with, by the way, Israel is only one part of it. If you are a people of the Jewish people, a person of the Jewish people, you should be curious about Jewish life in France and Jewish life in countries around in South America and in Ukraine and I'm not saying you have to learn all those languages, but at least to familiarize yourself with the life of Jews elsewhere. And nowhere is this more important than the life of Jews in Israel. So I think that what you're describing, the sort of projected fantasy version of Israel, and I felt it too, by the way. The first time I went to APAC Policy Conference, it was very shocking for me because they were talking about, I felt like they were talking about a country that wasn't my country. Okay, or they were being very loose with the deployment of IDF soldiers when, for me, it's my kids, right? I remember sitting in a very high-level lunch in New York City with a lot of donors and scholars, and I won't go into who it was, but the topic of the conversation was what's going to happen with Iran. And the claim was being made by this American scholar that Israel will have no choice but to fight Iran directly on its own, because America's not going to do it. And so he's sitting there pushing for Israel to attack Iran. And I'm thinking to myself, who are you that you play so easily with my kids' lives and my country's strategic decision making? You're not Israeli. You don't live there. You don't. Okay, fine, you have a calculus as a strategic affairs scholar, and you might even be right, but who are you? Okay, that was my response to it. And so I think that on the pro-Israel side, and then on the anti-Israel side, I think, or the critical of Israel side, I think it's even more obvious that there is, it's just a question of your own mental humility, right? Why do you make it a point to get up and speak out about things, about countries you don't live in or have never, or even never visited? Does this become central to your own agitation when, as an Israeli, I look at America and I say, you guys have a few issues to handle on your, in your own country as well. Why are we your focus? So I think that in all areas in life, your generation of opinions should be at least somewhat connected to your familiarity with the subject matter, and to learn how to say, as the sages taught, teach your tongue to say, "I do not know." It's in Pirkei Avot. It's really an important just habit to be in. Yes, you should have opinions, but you should also learn what kind of knowledge is required to develop opinions, and instead, and until then, say, I'm still learning.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's, we talked about a lot of things. We covered a lot of ground. And I think that this is a good moment, if we looked a little bit backwards, right? Your story, how you reached this point, the book, where it is now. You mentioned this kind of in brief at the beginning about this article that you wrote for Sapir about the need for American Jewry to kind of see this moment as a war against the Jews. And I think the piece is very interesting and very relevant, obvious. And I think that I'm curious to hear, we can dive into specific points of it, but I'm curious if there are those that you feel are much more necessary in terms of prioritizing them, assuming we can't do all at once. Maybe share a little bit more about what is in the piece for those who haven't read it, and then we'll go in there.
Well, first of all, I do believe we can do all at once. I don't think there's anything that I put in there that shouldn't be a priority. However, I will point to items 7 and 8 of the 8-point plan. 7 was a rethinking of philanthropic priorities. And I think it's incredibly noble and incredibly helpful that the Jewish philanthropic world mobilized for Israel. But the moment you see this as a war against the Jews and not just a war against Israel, the moment you realize that as hard a time as Israelis are having, we also have a government budget with $140 billion a year to handle at least a significant part of those responsibilities. And at the same time, there's a just enormous challenge against Jewish life in the diaspora that I think that an important philanthropic priority needs to be strengthening Jewish communities, whether it's JCCs or campus organizations or especially outlying communities, both inside the United States and around the diaspora. I think that this is an absolutely crucial moment to recognize that there needs to be a shift. It's not just about helping Israel. And in some ways, it's much more urgent than directing philanthropic resources to the state of Israel.
Do you think that ties into, I'm very interested in the way that you're describing this imagined connection or this fantasy version of Israel. It doesn't matter which side you look at it.
Okay.
But I imagine the answer to be yes. But the need to jump in to support Israel in that way. And again, I think it's beautiful and inspiring and incredibly generous, and also kind of feeds into that same kind of paradigm of looking at the nature of the relationship.
Yeah.
And so is there a way for us to you just said it, right? Like we have to look inward, right? There's Israel it has its independent economy, it has everything. How do we explain that within itself is also supporting Israel, right? Like doubling down here, right? Because people feel like they want to help, they want to go over and do there. They can't go to the army, they can't do any of that stuff. So this is the next best thing is we'll send in money. And I say no, actually, part of that is also here.
Yeah, look, I think that I'm one of those people who thinks that the Israeli government budget priorities should also include much, much more heavy investment in the diaspora, including the Western diaspora. We're just not in the same relationship financially that we were in 50 years ago, where Israel was a poor country and American Jews had all these resources. Israel's not a poor country anymore, and therefore it should behave towards its diaspora the way that a country like France, or even with all of its Institut Français and Alliance schools and all of that stuff, where they really, and it's not just France, obviously the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Saudis have been doing a great job of it, but even Greece, which has not a lot of financial resources, puts money into the study of Greek language education around the world. So I do believe very strongly that Israel should dramatically increase its budgetary allocations for the diaspora, including American Jewry.
How do we make the case that investing here, investing inward, right, by American philanthropists is also supporting Israel in a way?
Look,
because the impulse is to help, right? It's not. It's a very even if we think it's I wouldn't say misguided, but it can be not the whole whatever. I don't want to use any judgmental because it is really beautiful and inspiring, but making the case that we have to double down here as well, even when emergency strikes there, because the war against the Jews, because and that will help the relationship and strengthen ourselves and each other.
Look, any healthy relationship requires two equal partners who invest in themselves and are strong.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't want a relationship of dependency in either direction. You don't want Israelis to feel dependent on diaspora Jews, and you don't want the diaspora to feel too dependent on Israel. So both sides will always benefit from the other being strong. And it's especially disturbing, I will go so far as to say disturbing, to see American Jews mobilize under the assumption that Israel's about to be destroyed when they don't see the threats or they don't allocate according to the threats that are evident to me to diaspora Jewry. Because, this is a war. It will end at some point. The war in Israel, the war against Hamas. Perhaps there will be more in the north, and we have the Houthis involved now, and there is the big Iranian problem, and yes, there is a conflict. But right now we're talking about a conflict in Gaza that will end. It might take months, it might take a year, I don't know. The war against the Jews might not end so quickly, because once these powers have been unleashed, once all these masks have been removed, once Westerners, meaning non-Jews of the West, recognize that this is not just a threat against Jews, but a threat against a very core aspect, or Western civilization as a whole, and their way of life as a whole, and that it's a real threat. This is a conflict that's going to go on. And the time to allocate and the time to invest in strengthening the diaspora is now. So that, which kind of leads me also to item number 8. Right, I mentioned item number 7 was about philanthropic allocations. Item number 8 was called Fight the Long-Term Battles Now. And by that what I mean is that the powers that have been unleashed across the world, and especially across the Western world, and on campuses and in universities and in elite institutions against the Jews, that didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, in fact, it is the result of decades of investment at the level of ideas, at the level of what do we think about. Every single argument you hear against Israel or against the Jews, whether it's colonialism and apartheid and racism and that the Jews are a privileged community of privilege, and therefore they're in this category of oppressors, even if their parents escaped the Holocaust and they grew up in poverty. It doesn't matter because you're Jewish, you're an oppressor category. All of that had its origins in books, in ideas, in books that were written in Moscow, in books that were written in Paris, in books that were written in Morningside Heights at Columbia University. There's been a huge, huge, huge investment that goes back to the Soviet era, as Isabella Toborovsky's essay points out. I mean, she's really amazing. I saw her give a talk at the City University of New York where she shows actual pamphlets that the Soviets distributed in millions of copies across American campuses in the early 1970s. What are their titles? Israel is apartheid. Zionism is racism. Zionism is colonialism. Like all of the things that we're hearing, all of the signs that we see in these rallies, the Soviets were investing extremely heavily in these ideas as part of their Cold War strategy in the wake of the Six-Day War. So this has all been happening for decades and decades. All the students who were reading those pamphlets are now professor emeritus and university presidents and so forth. They're really like leading lights. And we've been really kind of derelict in the battle of ideas. We haven't really responded. And I've been in this ideas field for 30 years. And believe me, the house is burning down, we can't afford to deal with books right now. That's been going on since I got involved, and I'm sure it's been going on a lot longer than that. The time to fight the long-term battles is now, and it's been now for a very long time, because everything we are seeing is a result of our own neglect. And it leads me to think, everybody loves to talk about the huge, correctly to talk about the enormous intelligence failure on the part of the Israelis leading up to October 7th. Well, I hate to say it, but there's been an intelligence failure in the diaspora as well. Okay, because the diaspora, an American Jewry, was built on a whole series of defense organizations whose entire purpose was to make Jews safe in America. And they failed to identify the growing threat. It's not that nobody wrote about it or talked about it. I can point to essays and books, and I was involved in it for years and decades. But they failed, and if American Jews don't see this as a moment for introspection of that failure as well, we're going to end up repeating the mistakes. And so I think that it's very possible that one of the lines I had, and I, again, don't mean any offense to anyone, but a war that was launched with books cannot be defeated with billboards. Like, it doesn't work that way. We need to invest in ideas. We need to invest in books.
Yeah. Thank you. That was quite the journey. Just in terms of one last, I think, thought on investing in ideas and books, because I think this might come up for some people. And maybe this is an assumption, and I think it's worth spelling out. Then, books is step one, but how do we get those ideas beyond the bookshelf? I mean, because we have seen, I think, over the years in American Jewish life, and I think it's part of like a broader American phenomenon. I don't think it's most things that are like uniquely Jewish are not really uniquely Jewish here in America, or influenced by what's going on. But this idea of like the elite or the exceptionalism, and how to who do we have to influence and reach in terms of these ideas, but for them to work, because the way Jewish life is structured around the community, it's about participation from everybody, right? It's not just by some cadre of leaders, but really involved. How do we make sure that those ideas don't just stay up, in the highest planes?
Well, look, it happens that I've spent decades studying the question of how do ideas move? How do they originate, and how do they percolate, and how do they penetrate? And there really is an answer to that question. Okay, books are an important feature, because if you're not investing in books, I don't think you're investing in ideas at all. But there is a public discourse, and there is an academic discourse. These are two different conversations that are happening in every society all the time, or at least in every free society. And the question of how do you influence the public discourse, the academic discourse, and in the Jewish case, there's also a communal discourse. So one of the reasons why we've created a partnership and in the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities is that if we can make an investment that simultaneously takes on the generation of new ideas, and by new ideas what I mean is strategies, conceptualizations, new prisms through which to understand both our past and our future, that empower Jews to build proud, fruitful Jewish lives. The craft of that exists. That's something that I've been studying, and something that the folks over at Wicked Sun Books and Adam Bellow has been studying, and you've been studying through your creation of the Z3 project and the leadership labs and the communal networks that you've built, which I think are just incredible. So the idea here is to combine these and to create a synergy in which we identify writers, thinkers, scholars who have the ability to really formulate new thinking that will be the core of Jewish life in the future. And I think this is an incredibly, horrible and fruitful potential moment for Western Jewry, for diaspora Jewry, also for Israelis in a different context, because we all kind of know deep in our hearts that we have to do a lot of rethinking. We need new thinkers, we need new public intellectuals, and we need the tools to translate those into communal programming and communal structures that might involve new institutions and might involve actually shutting down old ones, believe it or not. So much of American Jewish life, whether it's denominational and rabbinic or communal or national, are institutions that are a century old and more. And although there is at the same time a lot of initiative, a lot of creativity, and I don't want to say that it's not stagnant at all, but American Jewish life needs to kind of retool and recalibrate, and it needs the people who are going to help them do that. And it's on everything. Questions of what is Zionism, and how does that relate to diaspora life? What is Jewish education, and how do we make sure it's both professional and cutting edge in its methodologies, but also taps into the core identity pieces that need to be addressed. What do we do with the fact that we've created all these Holocaust education institutions that have apparently, according to studies, had zero effect on reducing anti-Semitism in America? And this is something that Dara Horn writes about in Jewish Priorities as well, and she's been very active in kind of trying to help recalibrate that. Questions about philanthropy. Again, philanthropic priorities, but also philanthropic methods, right? One of the questions that that you pointed to, is why do philanthropists behave the way they do? Well, a lot of it is because it's what they feel, right? It gives them a sense of doing something important with their lives, but how you feel isn't always directly related to impact. And so really interesting questions need to be asked and need to be addressed about how to help philanthropists move from, I do this because I feel like it, to I do it because it really moves the needle or improves American Jewish life. So all of these questions need to be asked. And I do think they go as far as our religious life and as far as our learning habits in terms of looking inward into our own past and our own textual legacy that we own. And it's really one of the amazing phenomena in Israel is that every 10 or 15 years there's a movement among very secular Israelis to kind of reclaim the literary tradition, the Jewish bookshelf. And so you have like these secular yeshivas that pop up, and you have people like Ruth Calderon, who has been just incredible in promoting this concept and teaching it. And it keeps coming back because Israel's literary legacy and its intellectual legacy, Ben Gurion, who insisted on teaching Bible and saw the Bible as a national heritage rather than a religious text, and encouraged Bible education for all Israelis across the board. And I think it would be just incredible to see some kind of secular Jewish mass movement of a return to texts, again, not as a religious act, but as a core fundamental, I am a Jew, therefore I know how to read a Talmud. I read a daf of Gemara. I'm a Jew, therefore I can tell the difference between Psalms and Proverbs. We've given up so much, and especially in a civilization that's very, compared to other countries, very Christian. It almost feels like we've given up our texts to others when they're ours, and we need to see them as ours, and we need to have access to them. So I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done in rethinking and revitalizing the core elements of Jewish identity across the diaspora.
Great. So that's, I mean, it's a perfect place for us to end.
Okay.
You know, with kind of this like, you know, by the time this episode will be out, the announcement about this partnership will be much more public. But you know, just coming together around this work, I think, is going to really complete the picture in terms of Z3's attempts to influence discourse, and not just on a not superficial, but on a surface level at least, of kind of like just, you know, we need to argue, we need to disagree, but much more also introducing new lenses, new prisms, new angles to which we think, you know, see our past and our future. And we couldn't be more honored and excited to have you take the lead on that. And there'll be a lot more, you know, about this. But really, thank you for.
Well, look, I'm the one who feels honored.
Yeah.
Sorry. Look, I'm the one who feels honored because I've just been in awe of the work that the Z3 Project has done up till this point. And I think that if anybody has the ability to really inject something new into American Jewish life, it's the Z3 Project. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be adding something, hopefully, to the amazing work that the Z3 Project has done. And I just look forward to this partnership. It's going to be great.
It'll be great. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And more to come.
Yep.